Well, good morning. I'm not going to do an update on some of the other books that I finished reading over the weekend. I just thought I'd share the current book I'm reading. I'm about three quarters of the way through. I'm going to finish it today because it's just absolutely phenomenal. The book is "Say Nothing" by Patrick Keefe. Pardon my pronunciation. Um, Long story short, the book is about um, the mystery of a lady who went missing in the 70s, and the family never got closure for about 30 years. Uh, and in the telling of this story, we end up with the history of the troubles in the modern era, right? The 60s, 70s, 80s of Ireland and the north of Ireland. So both the Republic of and the north of Ireland. Fabulous book. The history, I've actually, like I said, I read about three quarters of it, and I've just vetted some of the major little points in history, and it looks like dead on, right? There's no issues whatsoever. In fact, the book might highlight how poor Wikipedia is, once again, in another area. But what I thought I'd share is there was an insight I had recently because I think I hurt a friend's feelings. I myself don't feel that politics really is any different than everyday life. What I mean by that is I think all politicians are pretty much corrupt. As I said recently, by the time you've even heard of a politician, they've probably bought and sold themselves about a dozen times over. So what they used to believe in, they probably don't believe in themselves. They probably don't even remember what they used to believe in, right? And this book really does highlight that this is just a human affect. So, what I thought I'd give is just why politics, to me, are important and why I take such strong stances on many things. I try very hard to understand both sides. I've talked about my superpower being sophistry, right? I will steelman my opponent's position so that I can better understand my own. But you really do have to do this so you can understand both sides, really. So actually, I did a little script for the first time, right? Just so I can mention, there's a few little details about this. So first of all, the book "Say Nothing" I think is fabulous, well worth reading or listening to, by the way. Um, and it's very, very telling. One little insight that I had that it seems is now agreed is that unlike the resolution in South Africa, the conflict in Ireland is sitting. What did he say here? His actual words were. He called it a lack of resolution. He called it irresolution, right? And so he's just getting into something quite interesting. The Boston College was looking to do some interviews, what they called an endeavor to understand what they called phenomenology of sectarian violence. Um, I would hope that that was in a wish to prevent sectarian violence, right? To understand the disenfranchised. Oh, that was one more thing that I forgot to mention. I can put that last. Okay, so little personal insight. I am of Irish as well as some other descent. I've mentioned the French, and this is where it's going to come in. My family came over before the Irish famine. The family story always spoke of regicide, but that's not what brought us over here, believe it or not. That regicide was really way back in our past. So the way this family history goes, it goes back to the plantations. It goes back to the north of Ireland, where we were displaced to County Clare area. The family is, by all accounts, always been very Republican, very Celtic. I used to get some attitude as a kid because you used to talk about being Irish Canadian. And people didn't understand what I meant by that. I'm the firstborn Irish male heir going all the way back to Ireland. That wasn't it. It's a different identity. As an Irish person, I've mentioned this, that when I was a teenager, I was able to read Black Like Me by Griffiths, and it resonated for me. And I'm going to mention W.E.B. Du Bois later, and also why his writing resonated. And it's going to surprise you, as it surprised me when I first looked into it, right? Because I didn't understand. I've talked about this before, that I've worked with people of other cultures, and yet, even though I'm look pretty white, I got accepted and was treated differently. Another funny story that happened to me in high school, that I would have teachers more than once. I think it was about 3 times. Teachers asked me, what tribe I was in, or different questions that showed that they thought I was Indian. And the reason was because in the art class, I sat beside the only person to sit beside the Indian in class. My buddy eventually did, but he didn't join the class till later. So that's why I say the only person to sit with him. Biology, it was the same. We had, I remember, I think it was grade 10 biology. We had 3 students from way up north in Ontario, and they were sitting at the back. And I mean, I used to chat with them like they were just, another student, right? They self segregated because of the culture. It was a little weird. And then there was another teacher who was just downright rude. I think he was an English teacher, and he was just, he was a rough one, right? So that was, I used to joke, was my first experience with discrimination. I mean, being Irish, there was always the joke that there used to be signs, right? No, no dogs, no Irishmen. But I myself didn't experience it until I experienced that. Maybe my name. I mean, I experienced a lot of discrimination. I just thought it because my name was a little different. I was actually supposed to be named Seamus, but my mother thought it was too Irish. I was supposed to be named Peter James before that, but cousins stole the name supposedly, so I had to be given a different one. So imagine the damage, and I've looked into this too. Uh, for most people, your first name is your favorite word, but it never was for me because I was raised from an early age that I was supposed to be Peter James, and then my father wanted Seamus, and then my mom settled on Sean, which is odd. Until I found out what it actually means, which is kind of cool. But that's neither here nor there. The family history that we uncovered that relates to the Troubles is this disenfranchisement. My family fought against the English because most people don't realize that some of the first slaves in the New World were white Irish. And for over a millennia, over 1,000 years, the English had occupied Ireland, right? Colonizers and occupiers, still to this day. And even during the Angorta Mór, the time of the Troubles, the Great Famine, the British were still exporting more than enough food to feed everybody on the island. So it's a sad bit of story. And as I said, this author talks about how they've realized that because there was no resolution from all of these different civil wars in the 1800s and again in the early 1900s and again later in the early 1900s and then again and again, mostly smaller ones, till we hit the 70s. And then he talked about how we never had this, what would you call it? Very similar to South Africa, where they had their Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Canada has shown the exact same thing, where we had an 8 or 9 year struggle, an attempt at truth and reconciliation. And in the end, it just caused for even more disenfranchisement. Why? Because we just never accepted the fact that when you treat another human being as less than human, that's something that just cannot abide. It will destroy the society as much as it will destroy the human being, right? And so my family, Irish family, supposedly were guilty of not just one, but multiple instances of regicide. And so supposedly after, a few times, the story was after 3 times of trying to kill a king, we had to flee Ireland. They were coming for us, as it were. But what's interesting is this was missed in family lore, is that the family in particular, this one gentleman fled to France. And there is no shortage of history. It's quite interesting here in Canada that Quebec took in a lot of the Irish orphans who lost parents on the trip or who had lost parents before and were shipped over. So there's lots of French Irish. But what was interesting is there's no shortage of the Irish and the French, working together. There's something called the Irish Regiment. So I actually had family who served in the Irish Regiment as an officer and served honorably to the point where he was even given vineyards because of his service to the crown. As well, this same family member actually showed Ben Franklin around France during the time of the Revolution and was actually thanked for his service in, helping the cause, as it were, of revolution in America. Because supposedly he even gave some help to the French Revolution as well, right? Which may have led to him losing those vineyards. But because he was in good stead of both, he wasn't, expelled. But what's interesting is this family member also married. I know it's really convoluted. It's amazing the family never talked about this. But in his time over in France, the reason why he stayed was he actually married a French lady. He fell in love with the daughter of Comte Déon de Beaumont. He was from Tonnerre in Burgundy. It's interesting because it was originally a Celtic settlement, then later taken over by the Romans. Why it's interesting is that Comte Déon, this is my great grandmother's father, was well known as one of the greatest super spies. So I found that incredibly entertaining to find out that little tidbit. But even more interesting, after things started to get a little spicy over in France, he eventually made his way back to Ireland, where, as family lore goes, and I've looked into it, it looks like it might actually be true, a member of the family took up selling heraldry, right? Selling family history, and may have even invented the O apostrophe in the Irish naming convention, because arguably my family was originally Max, even though we were Irish. That's a whole separate argument as to, and then took on this O apostrophe. And the family used to talk about whether you had money or not. You came over with the O. But it looks like they didn't understand that this was all an invention of one of our families. But what's interesting is it also looks like it might have been a Republican subterfuge, because the O looks like it was an attempt to show who was or who wasn't still a Republican. Because even more so, I've tracked the name Sean back to about the same period in Ireland. It's not really, it doesn't look like it's an ancient Celtic name, but it definitely is Celtic, right, Sean? But if you look at, again, this relative who was selling, heritage or heraldry, whatever you want to call it, paternity, I can't remember what they actually call it. If you break down one of the oldest alphabets in the world, the Om or the Ogham alphabet, depending on at what period in time you're pronouncing it, the Om alphabet, I say Om alphabet because you get the play on words, right? I went with the naming convention of Al Om, Almighty Om, which without the H is a reference to Om Tat Sat in Sanskrit, which is all of creation. Right? That's the universe, self, and bliss. But Om, OHM, is a measurement of resistance. And then the Om, the alphabet itself, actually is one of the oldest languages or means of communication we have. So for someone who's a fan of philology, of language, of meaning, of the phenomenology of self, meaning what is the self and why do we have it and what's, I found it all interesting, especially when you look at the name Sean, which has become kind of an Irish name. I mean, I know there's Sean Connery, the Scot, but we won't go into. Scots are actually Irish. The Celts, we're very connected. It depends on how far back in history you go. But what I love about the name Sean, and I didn't even realize this till after I was giving tours at that Chinese temple, I found out that Sean is actually three of the Om characters, which is a surprise because it's all of the characters in the name Sean, because technically the name Sean is three characters, not four, in the original Guelga, or the Om alphabet, the Ogam alphabet, because you have the S, the EA or the AE sound, and the N. And what that breaks down to, the S, the EA, and the N, that breaks down to essentially a druid or a wizard or someone of great spiritual power. And the reason why I chuckle is that's our family lore, is we've always been very Celtic and very I don't know what the word you'd use, but proud of our heritage, right? And then giving tours in the Chinese temple, I used to find it weird because they'd say my name, and they were a little weird, my name, and I thought maybe it was because it sounded like how they pronounce Chan, right? The Chinese Zen practice Chan. But it wasn't until later that I found out that a mountain man or a wizard or a person of great spiritual power is considered Xian in Chinese, right? So it's amazing how wasn't I didn't learn any of this until I learned how to read and understand all this stuff myself in my old age, right? When I actually said, you know what, I'm going to conquer this dyslexia. Lo and behold, I've done a little research, and it looks like that, yes, not resolving this trauma in Northern Ireland has left the place in a lot of trouble. And it looks like, yes, I was right about dyslexia. It is definitely something that you can overcome. It is definitely something you can work with, and it may eventually become a superpower as well, but not till you learn how to work within it. And the problem is it looks like teachers are starting to agree with me, is there's far too many people who don't learn the way we think is typical learning. I argue we are all atypical in how we learn, but teachers aren't quite there yet. But they are agreeing with me that at least 1/5 of the population has some sort of learning difficulty. And maybe we should look at helping them with audiobooks or ebooks or whatever it may be. Um, and who knows what we might have, right? But as I said, um, a lot of this was news to me, especially in the last couple of years when I've learned how to read and decipher some of this information, learn how to research. As I said, once I was diagnosed with my disease, I was like everyone, expecting the doctor to help. But it wasn't until my doctor said, no, that's it. We got nothing else for you. We didn't know what it was. He didn't have anything more to help me with. He just gave up. And so, yeah, I was pretty sad for a while, but I didn't let that stop me. So I started to do my own research, and it was through doing my own research I realized, yeah, I ain't going to get very far unless I learn how to research. That joke I made about the university professor who failed his students. Why? Because they failed at research. But he knew they didn't learn how to research in high school. So what are you doing giving them a research assignment without teaching them how to research first? But little things that I've come to understand is some of my experience. I've mentioned before that I was a banker for a long time. And back in the late 90s, early 2000s, surprisingly, when they first brought computers to the bank, they had email. We had an email program. And I actually had a subscription to the Sinn Féin newsletter. And that was difficult to stop because this was long before they had the ability to just click a button that says unsubscribe. So I was afraid of getting in a lot of trouble because this was just prior to when they made all of these organizations illegal. Um, which I still don't agree with Sinn Féin because they're actually in Parliament now. But yes, that was a weird experience, right? But completely unrelated to an experience that happened a few years later. I was working in a branch. I think everyone was new there, but working with everyone, everything was going great until changes started to be made to my bank account. And I was like, what's going on here? And so I started asking around and we looked into it. And then we found out it was a service manager. So she had to admit that she was messing with my account. She's like, well, you shouldn't have this. And I don't think you should have this. And I'm like, I'm your boss. What are you doing messing with my account? Plus, my account was still domiciled at another branch because I had just been brought into this new branch. So she was actually breaking bank policy in so many ways. But you know what the real problem was? Is she kept doing it, even though she was told she wasn't allowed to and just stop. But she kept doing it. So when the manager finally brought her up on the carpet, what ended up being the problem was because my name is so Irish, she was triggered by her time living in England during the Troubles. Now, remember, she never experienced anything directly. It was just the trauma of being in a place, and we talked about this, that the most traumatizing in Northern Ireland were the people who weren't agents in their own destiny. They were the people who were just, going about their normal lives who might have gotten injured. That was the most traumatizing to these people. So I understand that she was traumatized, but imagine I was asked to understand why she had did this, and she was sorry about having done this. But oddly enough, she didn't get transferred out of the branch. I was the one that was transferred out fairly soon after. Ooh, that's a little weird, eh? I joke about that I've gone, in my lifetime, I've gone from oppressed to oppressor class without me having any say in it. It's quite funny because I mentioned the French and the Irish, but don't forget the family connection to North American indigenous. My grandmother, on my father's side, gave up her status to marry my grandfather. And at the time, I don't think it's much different, but at the time, her own tribe excommunicated her because men could marry a non-tribe member and they would make them part of the tribe. But if a woman, even the chief's daughter of all, yeah, was excommunicated, right? So this trauma that can set in, right? Right. So let's see if I covered everything here, right? So the history, Ireland, regicide, right? France, right? The name, Sinn Féin. Yeah, the newsletter, that was a weird one. Right, the Comte d'Eon's daughter. I mean, I have no doubt. I was talking about this before. Um, that trauma has affected almost everything. Many people miss Carl Jung. Most of his philosophy was influenced by what he witnessed in the First World War. Viktor Frankl, his experiences in the Second World War. Nietzsche was influenced, obviously, by the doubt and trauma of Charles Darwin, but also his experiences during the war. Right? I I think this can be said about so many others, but trauma. So the reason why I mention this is I read Black Like Me when I was young because it was not a hard read. I mean, it took me weeks, obviously, to read, but it was transformational. It's one of the few books I read when I was young. But it wasn't until a couple years ago that I learned how to read, especially digital, that I read a seminal text called W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk or the Souls of Colored Folk. I would just even rename it as The Souls of All Folk. Because what shocked me, I was actually just studying what W.E.B. Du Bois called the double consciousness, because I believed that the schism between the English and French in Canada, the Indigenous and themselves, their culture, and trying to be part of modern society, Indigenous and white people, the rich elite and the poor, middle class, against like all of the disenfranchisement, all of the have and have nots, all of the them versus us, I think all leads to a trauma that can lead to intergenerational trauma. But as I've said, this is what gets weird. All you need to do to contextualize this trauma, stop it from being kind of like a daemon that hangs over you, is narrative. And so it was surprising to me that I was dead on when I was reading this book about the troubles in Northern Ireland. And I'm thinking about this for here in North America. I'm thinking about everything that's gone on in the last couple of years. There's a lot of healing that needs to be done. And I was surprised to learn that it might be as simple as the biology and psychology of trauma. Trauma is simply going through an experience that you consider intense. So it could be a popular experience, it could be a scary experience, or it could just be a low level of fear lived out over an extended period of time. And what ends up happening is the mind registers so much more detail that in recall becomes so much more vivid. And when you add to a poorly processed experience, that those experiences tend to reverberate in the present. And what I mean by that is um, the body keeps the score. Dr. Vander Koltz, his entire premise of what trauma is and why it's so painful is we continue to experience the trauma today as if it were happening now. We smell it, we feel it. It's so tangible, it's so real. But all it takes, as I've talked about this before, is many people are traumatized by not the experience they had, but what they either remembered as the experience or how they integrated it, right? So what is shocking is it seems that today the greatest issue in society is this disenfranchisement, that we can't get together and discuss things. Like a couple years ago, I would have loved to have gone online and discuss some of this stuff like I used to with Buddhism. But I find nothing can be discussed anymore, right? If you want to talk about religion or philosophy or meaning, you'll get bogged down in pedantry or what somebody perceived is what you mean, or in my case, because I don't have much of a filter and I am very bombastic, I can activate people sometimes, right? I can come in a little hot, which is often misunderstood. My passion can be misunderstood as anger or vitriol, when in reality, it can more likely be frustration. I can't see these discussions taking place nowadays when the real problem is the trauma that we're all feeling, have felt, that we need to deal with. The solution to that trauma is talking about it honestly, openly, and actually having it out, right? A truth and reconciliation with oneself and with each other, right? Seeing us as an I and a thou. I recommend Martin Buber's book because he was so right about that. Soon as you start to see somebody else as an other, soon as you see somebody else as an it rather than an other, right? The sixth line in the Isha Upanishad states that the secret to uh, existence is to see the self, yourself, in others, even if they're different, and to see the other in oneself. So no matter how different somebody else is, the trick is to see that within oneself, right? Empathy, sympathy, what we call upeka or upeksha in Sanskrit and Pali, equanimity. Not well defined in English, but equanimité in French. Highly recommend going to Wikipedia in French, Wiktionary, I think it is. In French, the definition isn't bad there in French, and have Google or one of these translation sites translate the definition of this word. It is simply seeing that you're not the center of the universe, right? You're not at the center of the universe. In French, I would call that au bas du ciel. You're not the base of the sky. You're not the hinge pin of the universe. In reality, we are all the hinge pin of the universe because, as Jung said, we can't know who we are, individuation, without knowing the other. If you denature the humanity of the other, as W.E.B. Du Bois explains about double consciousness, it denatures that individual because they look in the mirror and they're like, I'm a person? What are you talking about? But the problem is, if you're willing to denature somebody else's humanity, it in turn automatically denatures your humanity. And that's what we're dealing with. So we have people that are seeing me and them, us versus them. They're dehumanizing others and in the process dehumanizing themselves, not knowing who they are, not knowing who they are, not knowing who anybody is. When this trauma starts to take us down, not having the ability to discuss this is causing further traumatization and disenfranchisement, right? So this is why I've said for years that I think we can look to other cultures, other times in history, as Hegel and Huxley both said, the truth is we can learn from history, but the saddest truth is we know we likely will not. Now, I say that, which is probably not the actual quote, I say that in the hopes that I can be wrong about that. I say that with the hopes that let's hope that Aldous Huxley is wrong, that the saddest truth isn't that we know that people won't look to history to learn. It's simply the real truth. Why Nietzsche was wrong about his criticism of Buddhism. It wasn't as he thinks. Buddhism would be perfect if it wasn't for the fact that it's ridiculous to think that there's enough people in this world willing to live selflessly for others. But that's where he's wrong. We don't need a lot. I love the Kabbalist teaching that there are 36 essentially wonderful human beings holding up the universe. I love that idea because I think to the inherent goodness of the human experience. And my proof is the madness of crowds, right? We talk about the madness of crowds often, but we forget to talk about the goodness of people and crowds. What I mean by that is if you look at how many people it takes to convince a crowd to riot versus how many people it takes in a crowd to convince that same crowd to do good, right? It takes far less good people to influence broader society. And to me, that's what was missed by Nietzsche. And Carl Jung reiterated this same critique in his Red Book, and I think he was wrong as well. I don't think it takes many. I mean, I talk about it when I was working in multiple different industries. I kept motivated not by all the people I helped every day, but the fact that after having spent a career in banking, I'm among the few bankers who can look back at all the positive influences I had. It may only be a handful, right? Because you could work years in a bank, never having the opportunity to help somebody, just dealing with rich people or opening banks for unappreciative people or mutual funds for people who have no real agency in their own investment or their own or even in their own life. As Carl Jung said, right? Most problems in this world can be um, sourced to the fact that most people walk around completely unconscious. And to that quote, I add acting unconsciously as well. So if we were to stop walking around mindlessly, if we start thinking and thinking before we act, right? I think then after a lifelong career, uh, arguably devoted to help people, because that's why I wanted to become a banker. I actually went to school for economics. And after having grown up watching a Canadian TV show called Traders, I wanted to be the crazy investment advisor, right? I even had I had this dream that I could design an algorithm that could help traders understand natural movements in the market. Now, this is before after hours trading. Back then, you used to be able to see trends, right? Like the easiest one to mention is wintertime gold. Wintertime oil prices would go up, especially in Canada. Declaration of war would cause gold prices to go up. Silly little things like that, right? Um, but the true sad part is being around the bank. Arguably, I grew up in the bank too, so we're talking 30 plus years in the bank. I only know of, I mean, I have my stories, but outside of that, I only know of maybe a half dozen other positive stories, right? Because as bankers, most of us weren't in it to get rich. Most of us were in it as a job. The vast majority of them were just doing a job. But then there was people like me who really thought that, your occupation really could be um, a net positive to the universe. That's something that's missed in English. Like in French, there's words for your occupation, but also talk about your value. It's what you do. It's what you produce. It's not who you are, but it's a big part of what goes into making up what you are. Right? I talked about that on my podcast, Almighty Om. It's available on Spotify. But I was just talking about, I called it the W's of self. From it, my understanding of that book, The Power of Wonder, it built on my studies of that neuroscientist who was studying the religious experience. And I thought that the religious experience was not that different from limerence or synchronicity. And I thought, if we can come to realize that we need to be an active agent in our, not just our experience, but in the meaning of that experience. I argue wonder, the sense of wonder, sense of awe, religious experience. These are more palpable to us because, as Nietzsche said, we have such a low estimation of ourselves that we attribute great accomplishments, great experiences, great outcomes, whatever you name it. We attribute these great harvests, great accomplishments. We attribute it to something outside of ourselves because we have such a low estimate. We think so lowly of ourselves, right? So I argue the reason why these experiences are more tangible is because we're absent in the experience, right? It happens to us. So I argue it's simply understanding this truth that we can begin to have greater faith in our own meaning application. I've talked about this before. It truly is the main takeaway from Nietzsche's Zarathustra. It's a single word, two words, but it's a different form of the same word, Schatzen or Schatzenchen. Pardon my pronunciation this morning, it's terrible. But Satchen simply just means your value, what you treasure, but it also has a sense of creativity, endeavor, right? And once we learn that it's the lack of agency, it's funny that it's taken this long for me to really realize how dead on I was. Like, I've been doing this podcast for almost 6 years now, almost 6 years. And I've been saying essentially the same thing, that it seems to me that we lack a sense of personal agency, which leads us to feel powerless, helpless in so many situations. And it seems when you look at this experience of wonder, it seems simply that the experience of wonder or awe is separated from the experience of everyday meaning, right? Simply because it seems, well, synchronicity, right? Synchronicity is simply seeing something as more valuable than it is, or having more meaning than it really does, because of causal factors that really can't be linked to this experience, right? And this experience of trauma or wonder and awe seems to be the inverse. So instead of us applying the meaning consciously, we end up being victims. I know that's a common buzzword today, but that's what I mean. We're not active agents in our own experience. We become uh, players upon a stage, as maybe that's what Shakespeare meant, right? All the world is a stage, and we're but players upon it. Only because we lack the conscious awareness to be present and the agency required to make a change. I've talked about this. It's amazing because it's completely lost in most translations. I believe it's Nishitani, but don't quote me on this. This is uh, an existential philosopher who was a Buddhist monk as well, from Japan, Kyoto University, by the way, studied with Heidegger, I believe, for a period because of his love for Nietzsche. But he used the term in Japanese called basho. Basho. It's Basho in the English. It means ground. But if you go and study the actual characters, made up of two Japanese characters, quite interesting because it's why Nishitani chose. And this almost shows how few people actually read these books. Because Nishitani is pretty clear about why he chose this term from Japanese, because it clearly states what's missing in the English. Basho is two characters. One character represents a soldier or a warrior outfitted for battle, right? So the one character speaks to the warrior is present and equipped, ready for action, ready for action. Now, the other character is ground, the place of action. So it denotes right place, right time. So when you combine being prepared, right? Sun Tzu said, right? Preparation, same as Budo. Technically goes back to the Chinese, and they both mean the way of peace, stopping a sword is what Wu in Chinese and Bu in Japanese means. So that's what Basho means. It's the philosophy that Nietzsche was trying to get across, which influenced Jung, this idea that the only reason why we suffer, the only reason why we suffer needlessly, why we feel like we're subject to torment, is because we feel lack of agency, right? Story of Job, in a sense, right? But truly, where is there a situation where we truly are suffering, um, completely oppressed? It really, I love the idea of Job, and don't quote me on this, but the idea that Job puts out how one person would manage the experience of truly suffering at the hands of an oppressor and being without any ability to remediate the situation, right? That's not going to happen for the most of us. Most of us are able to be an agent, even if we are in the midst of our suffering. And I think that's what is meant behind the idea of basho in Japanese, and why it goes all the way back to Nietzsche, and why it speaks to why so many of us suffer. Because we're not prepared, or we're not ready for action, or we're not aware and present for the situation. So we're not paying attention, we're not focusing, we're not thinking things through, but we're also not in the right place, the right time. How many times have you seen someone getting carried away over something? Wrong place, wrong time, right? So I know it seems odd to spend 44 minutes not even talking about the book I'm reading, but for me, it's amazing. Every time I look at doing a review of these books, I can't help but to see these strings that tie them together. And it's simply our humanity. That's all I'm seeing, right? That's my string theory, is that there are some universal truths. They're not universal, and they're not true in every situation. But sometimes the most important things in life need to be believed in, even if they're not true. And I steal that from the movie Secondhand Lines, but it is one of my favorite lines. This idea that may not be true, but we have to believe that good will triumph over evil. You know what I mean? True love never dies. These these cliches that really could be mantra. But on that, kept you far too long as it is. I cannot recommend the book any more highly. It is really well worth the listen. Really great insight. Even if you're not terribly interested in the troubles of the time, I think you can learn a lot about human experience. I mean, and I guess as a final, what is the phenomenology of sectarian violence? It really is no different than addiction. So don't treat the violence, don't treat the addiction, treat the pain. Treat the pain. When people, as Viktor Frankl said and as Nietzsche said before him, if you give the person a why, they can withstand any what. And the same can be said of withstanding suffering like Job. If you feel disenfranchised, if you feel like you're oppressed, it actually makes the felt pain worse. It makes the experience worse. Simply finding the meaning, even in the midst of great suffering, is the agency that seems to carry us through.